June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly in Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt's hand as he wrote in a hidden diary. Words that, if discovered, could have meant punishment by his own officers. "The Americans must be deceiving us," he wrote. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Only moments earlier, he had looked out from a train window and seen something that shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights illuminated everything. Farmhouses, street corners, storefronts. Stretching endlessly across the Texas plains, even at 10 p.m. in Germany, strict blackout measures had kept cities and countryside in near total darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only a fraction of rural areas had reliable electricity. Yet here, in the country they had been taught to see as weak and decadent, light seemed limitless. Around 1,850 veterans of the Afrika Korps stepped off the train. They hadn't arrived in freight cars or cramped wagons, but in comfortable Pullman coaches with dining service and sleeping compartments. The entire town of Mexia had gathered to watch. What none of them realized was that this moment marked the beginning of a profound psychological shift. A quiet but powerful dismantling of Nazi beliefs, driven not by force, but by the visible reality of American industrial strength and organization. The outcome of the war, in many ways, was already being decided not just on battlefields, but in factories, infrastructure, and logistics on a scale these men had never imagined. The turning point had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, with the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa during the Tunisia campaign. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, successor to Erwin Rommel, surrendered alongside roughly 275,000 German and Italian troops. These were not inexperienced soldiers. They were hardened veterans of desert warfare, men who had pushed British forces back toward Egypt and earned the respect of commanders like Bernard Montgomery. Now, they found themselves prisoners. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, a decorated veteran who had fought in France and been wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, later uncovered in archives, would provide one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of how captivity in America transformed German perceptions. Their journey from defeat to realization began in the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and tens of thousands of prisoners waited in temporary camps for transport, they witnessed something unexpected: efficiency. The U.S. Army processed prisoners at a speed and level of organization that surprised even seasoned soldiers. Thousands were registered daily, photographed, documented, and issued identification with a systematic precision that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, the best logistical efforts the German military had achieved at its peak. Medical examinations were completed, vaccinations administered, and the rights of prisoners under the Geneva Conventions were explained. In fluent German, by American officers specifically trained for that role. But the first real shock came with the food. Obergefreiter Hans Miller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, "In the camp at Oran, while we waited for transport, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months in the desert. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, an attempt to impress us. We didn't realize this was simply their normal ration. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic became the next revelation. These were Liberty ships, symbols of American industrial capacity. One of them, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been constructed in just over 4 days at a shipyard in California. Something that would have sounded like impossible propaganda to German ears. At the height of production, these ships were being completed at a staggering pace, allowing the United States to move enormous volumes of supplies, and now prisoners, across the ocean. By mid-1943, tens of thousands of POWs were transported each month aboard vessels that otherwise would have returned empty. The Atlantic crossing itself became another stage in what some prisoners later described as a quiet dismantling of their assumptions. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division recorded his impressions in letters home. The crew threw away more food in a single day than our entire company received in a week during the final months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, milk simply discarded. Not to insult us. They did it without thinking. To them, it meant nothing. Their supply seemed endless. The ships also became unexpected classrooms. Prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was just one of more than 2,700 Liberty ships built during the war. Each required hundreds of thousands of parts, produced across dozens of states and assembled with remarkable speed. Engines were manufactured in separate facilities and brought together in shipyards that had barely existed a few years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, from a long line of Prussian military officers, later recalled a moment that stayed with him. As we approached the American coast, I noticed the radar antenna turning above the bridge. We had believed such technology was limited to only a few nations, and even then in small numbers. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a cargo ship. It was at that moment, he wrote, that I first began to suspect that Germany had already lost the war. August 2nd, 1943. Naval Station Norfolk. The first sight of the United States shattered what remained of Nazi assumptions about American weakness. The base spread across thousands of acres, its docks stretching for miles, cranes lifting cargo with constant motion. In a single day, this one port handled more freight than some major German ports managed in an entire week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a former factory worker from the Ruhr, counted dozens of cargo ships being loaded and unloaded at once. In his secret diary, he noted how each crane lifted loads that back home would have required teams of men and horses. Here, everything ran on electricity. Smoothly, efficiently, without the smoke and strain he associated with German industry. As the prisoners were organized into columns and marched toward trains, another detail stood out. Parking areas were filled with civilian cars. Hundreds of them, belonging to ordinary dock workers. In Germany, private cars were rare, mostly reserved for elites. The long-promised people's car had never truly materialized. Yet here, even laborers drove their own vehicles to work. Then came the trains. Not freight wagons or crowded troop cars, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into beds. Dining cars with tablecloths and proper cutlery. Observation cars with wide windows. Feldwebel Friedrich Radke later wrote, "We boarded like travelers, not prisoners." The American guards themselves seemed almost uneasy about the level of comfort. One even apologized that the air conditioning in the carriage wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August. For many of the prisoners, that alone seemed unreal. The 3-day journey south became something more than transportation. It was a slow unraveling of everything they had been taught. As the train passed through towns and cities across Virginia and beyond, the prisoners watched in disbelief. Every settlement was lit. Streets, homes, storefronts. Places that in Germany might have had a single lamp now glowed with electric signs and illuminated windows. Houses showed multiple rooms lit at once. Factories operated through the night, their interiors glowing, parking areas still full even at late hours. The scale of activity never seemed to stop. One prisoner, whose father had been a local Nazi official, later wrote in a letter, "We passed through city after city that first night. Each one seemed to have more light than all of Hamburg. The guard told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity. I told him that was impossible. He simply said, 'You'll see.'" At one stop in a small Virginia town, the train paused to take on water and fuel. The prisoners watched railway workers complete the process in under half an hour. Tasks that would have taken far longer in Germany. Coal was loaded mechanically, water pumped electrically, maintenance performed with specialized equipment. It wasn't just speed. It was the system behind it. Everything worked together efficiently and continuously. And for many of the men watching from those train windows, it marked the moment when doubt began to replace certainty. Every detail of the operation seemed to reflect a level of technological and material advantage that many of the prisoners had never imagined. Even more unsettling was the everyday affluence of ordinary workers. They wore sturdy leather boots that would have cost a German laborer months of wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and casually discarded the empties. Cigarettes were smoked freely, often left unfinished. Feldwebel Heinrich Miller, an electrical engineer before the war, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He estimated that a single railway yard used more electricity in an hour than his entire district in Berlin consumed in a day. "The waste is astonishing," he wrote. "Lights burn in empty buildings. Fans run in vacant rooms. It is the carelessness of unlimited resources." As the trains moved deeper into the United States, the scale only grew. In Tennessee, the prisoners saw the vast Alcoa aluminum plant stretching for miles along the river. Its furnaces consumed enormous amounts of power. far beyond what many entire European cities could generate. Near Louisville, they passed the Rubber Town Complex, massive synthetic rubber facilities built in less than 2 years. These plants produced hundreds of thousands of tons annually, dwarfing German output despite Germany having pioneered the technology. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist who had worked for IG Farben, immediately grasped the significance. Each plant was more advanced than anything we had built, he later recalled. And there were several of them in one place. We were told there were many more across the country. Further north, near Detroit, the train passed the immense Willow Run bomber plant, built by Ford Motor Company. This single facility produced B-24 Liberator aircraft at a pace that seemed almost unreal. One completed roughly every hour at peak production. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down in North Africa, stared out the window and counted multiple bombers in various stages of assembly. We had been told American aircraft were inferior, he later wrote, but what I saw was precision, organization, and speed beyond anything we could imagine. As the journey continued, the contrast only deepened. In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River over the Eads Bridge. Below, barges carried immense quantities of grain. Storage elevators lined the riverbanks, each holding enough food to sustain entire populations. Carl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, noted the scale in disbelief. They move food the way we move ammunition, without concern for shortage. I saw enough wheat loaded onto a single barge to feed my village for years. In Kansas City, the train stopped near vast stockyards filled with cattle. The surrounding meatpacking plants filled the air with their presence. For prisoners who had survived on minimal rations, the sight of workers casually eating meat during their breaks was striking. They eat meat the way we eat bread, one soldier wrote. With each mile, the journey became more than transportation. It became a confrontation with a reality that directly contradicted everything they had been taught. No, one prisoner later corrected, that wasn't accurate. They ate meat the way we wished we could eat bread. He described how a guard bought them hamburgers from a small stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on soft white bread. The guard purchased 20 of them casually, paying with a single dollar bill. It wasn't a special occasion. It was simply ordinary food. When the prisoners arrived at camps like Camp Hearn, the contrast deepened even further. Built in just a few months, the camp housed thousands of prisoners in conditions many had never experienced even before the war. Wooden barracks were equipped with electric lighting, running water, flush toilets, hot showers, and heating systems. The medical facilities were especially striking. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a surgeon captured in North Africa, found himself working in a hospital better equipped than many in Germany. It had X-ray machines, modern surgical tools, and a steady supply of medicines that had long disappeared back home. They had penicillin, he later recalled, a drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even for minor infections. In Germany, soldiers were dying for lack of basic treatment, and here it was given without hesitation, even to prisoners. The kitchens offered another lesson. Prisoners assigned to food preparation encountered industrial-scale equipment, walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, dishwashing machines, and large cooking ranges capable of feeding thousands. Daily meals included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, foods that had become scarce or unavailable in wartime Germany. Otto Krebs, a former chef, wrote in disbelief, "Today we discarded more food than my family has seen in years, not because it was spoiled, simply because there was too much. Regulations required extra portions to ensure no one went without. The surplus was thrown away. I could hardly bear to see it." By late 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to prisoners being assigned to work in farms and factories. What began as a practical solution became something far more significant. Transported daily to work sites without strict concealment, prisoners were exposed to ordinary American life. They saw vast fields of crops, factories operating continuously, stores filled with goods, and neighborhoods where even modest homes had radios and refrigerators. At a cotton processing facility near Houston, one prisoner observed a single machine handling more output in an hour than his entire village could have managed in a month. The equipment ran on electricity supplied through regional infrastructure that had already reached most rural areas. The farmer who owned it was nothing extraordinary, he noted. Just an ordinary man, with access to resources we could hardly imagine. With each passing day, the experience chipped away at what they had believed. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation of observations. Small, undeniable realities that forced a gradual reassessment of everything they thought they knew. Not aristocrats, not party officials, just ordinary farmers. Yet they had electricity, running water, trucks, cars, and tractors. Even their workers ate lunches that, to the prisoners, seemed impossibly abundant. And this wasn't unusual. It was typical. In the Midwest, prisoners assigned to agricultural work witnessed a level of mechanization that challenged everything they knew. In Nebraska, a single combine harvester could replace the labor of dozens of men. Fields stretched to the horizon, many larger than entire districts back in Germany. Farmers spoke casually about yields, 60 bushels of wheat per acre, figures that would have seemed unrealistic in Europe. Gefrieter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working near Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his life. When he commented on it, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good machine. His family was waiting for a better one from John Deere." For many prisoners, however, the most striking experiences came near industrial sites. While they were not assigned directly to weapons production, they often worked in supporting industries, giving them a window into the broader system behind American output. At a Campbell Soup Company facility in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines processing enormous quantities of food with remarkable efficiency. Conveyor systems, automated filling equipment, and large-scale cooking systems allowed a relatively small workforce to produce far more than comparable factories in Germany. One former German food worker noted that a single operator could oversee processes that would have required dozens of workers back home. What stood out wasn't just the scale, but the consistency and organization behind it. Near Detroit, prisoners working at a power plant saw glimpses of the massive River Rouge complex operated by Ford Motor Company. This enormous industrial center employed tens of thousands of workers and had been converted to produce military equipment, from vehicles to engines. One prisoner described rows of worker parking areas filled with personal cars, something that stood in sharp contrast to conditions in wartime Germany. To them, the idea that ordinary industrial workers could own, and regularly use, private vehicles was difficult to reconcile with what they had known. What they were seeing piece by piece was not just production. It was a system built on scale, infrastructure, and access to resources that operated far beyond their previous expectations. By the winter of 1943, the cumulative effect of everything the prisoners had seen began to produce what American intelligence officers informally described as a kind of ideological collapse. A quiet shift was underway inside the camps. The Special Projects Division, part of the Provost Marshal General's office, noticed a steady rise in requests from prisoners for newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, one of the officers observing this change, reported in late 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when presented with production figures. They have seen too much with their own eyes. Even the most committed Nazis have grown silent. They still speak of loyalty to Germany, but no longer of victory." Camp newspapers, often written and edited by the prisoners themselves, began to reflect this transformation. At Fort Kearny POW camp, a publication gradually shifted in tone. From rigid nationalism to discussions about political systems, economics, and what the future might look like after the war. Editors, often selected from anti-Nazi prisoners, found that their audience was becoming more open to new ideas. One officer captured in North Africa wrote in a censored letter, "We were told America was weak, divided, incapable. Yet everything I see contradicts that. This is an organized, powerful nation. We were misled." Another unexpected turning point came after the Italian surrender in September 1943. Italian prisoners who chose to cooperate were reorganized into labor and service units, receiving better conditions and more freedom. German prisoners observed as their former allies worked alongside Americans, earned wages, and in some cases interacted freely with local communities. Friedrich Schultz, a German officer, noted the contrast. "The Italians abandoned us, yet they are treated with dignity. They work, they are paid, they send goods home. There is no hatred shown to them. This system we were taught to despise seems in practice more humane than our own." Then came December. Across the United States, churches, civic groups, and volunteers sent hundreds of thousands of Christmas packages to prisoners of war, men who, only months earlier, had been fighting against American forces. The parcels contained small but meaningful items: sweets, cigarettes, toiletries, games. At Camp Hearn, local residents contributed in their own way. A church choir performed Christmas songs in German. Families sent homemade baked goods. Youth groups delivered handwritten cards. For many prisoners, this moment carried a deeper weight than anything they had previously experienced. One officer, whose family had suffered during Allied bombing in Germany, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many of them have loved ones fighting against us. And yet, they treat us with a kindness that feels genuine. Not staged, not forced. It wasn't a single event that changed minds, but a pattern. Repeated, consistent, and difficult to dismiss." Over time, these experiences created a growing gap between what the prisoners had been taught and what they were now seeing firsthand. What kind of people treat their enemies this way? One prisoner wrote, "Only those completely confident in their strength and certain of victory." The Christmas meal itself was beyond anything they could process. Roast turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, even ice cream. Foods that had long disappeared from wartime Europe. Many prisoners ate until they were physically ill, unable to grasp how such abundance could be offered to enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote one soldier. "Better than generals, better than party officials." And the guards told us this was nothing unusual, that this was how ordinary American families celebrated Christmas. By early 1944, tens of thousands of German prisoners had enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, history, mathematics, and science. Institutions like University of Chicago and Stanford University contributed materials, courses, and even visiting lecturers. For many prisoners, this exposure was transformative. They had been taught that Americans lacked culture and intellectual depth, yet they encountered extensive libraries, accessible universities, and open academic discussion. Newspapers were freely available, offering multiple viewpoints. Something unfamiliar under strict censorship. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist formerly associated with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on modern physics while in captivity. He later reflected, "American professors, even those who had fled Germany, taught us without hostility. They spoke of science as something universal. They were ahead in research, yet they shared knowledge freely, even with prisoners." Entertainment reinforced this contrast. Camp theaters screened mainstream films, not propaganda but popular productions like Gone with the Wind and The Grapes of Wrath. What struck the prisoners was not just the storytelling but the openness. These films portrayed hardship, conflict, even national struggles. Yet they were shown without restriction. "They hide nothing," one officer wrote. "They show their weaknesses as well as their strengths." In Germany, such honesty would be punished. Here, it seems to make them stronger. By the spring of 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded further as American industry reached full capacity. German POWs worked in food processing plants, mills, and support industries, witnessing production on a scale that few had imagined possible. At facilities like the Higgins Industries shipyard, prisoners helped handle materials used to build landing craft. There, they observed an industrial system operating continuously. Day and night, thousands of workers, including large numbers of women, operated machinery, assembled components, and kept production flowing without interruption. One prisoner noted the diversity of the workforce and the constant pace. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Everything we were told could not work, worked. And it worked without stopping. For many, these experiences didn't just challenge assumptions. They replaced them with something far more difficult to ignore: direct observation of a system that functioned at a scale and consistency they had never encountered before. "They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy could build in a year," one prisoner remarked, trying to process what he had seen. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed industrial output on a scale that seemed almost unreal. Thousands of tons of steel were produced daily as blast furnaces operated without pause. Trains continuously delivered iron ore and coal, feeding a system that never appeared to slow down. One former German industrial worker wrote, "I thought I understood production before the war. But this was something else entirely. They wasted more material than we could produce." What struck them most was not just the volume, but the conditions. Workers complained about overtime, even while producing quantities that German factories under far harsher conditions struggled to match. By the summer of 1944, prisoners working in agriculture across the Midwest encountered another form of overwhelming scale. In states like Kansas, they watched harvests where individual farms produced more grain than entire regions in Europe. Modern machinery transformed the process. Combines moved steadily across vast fields, harvesting enormous areas each day. Grain storage facilities towered over the landscape, capable of holding quantities that dwarfed anything the prisoners had known. One farmer from East Prussia wrote, "One American farmer, with machines, does the work of many of ours. The scale is beyond comparison." In Central Valley, prisoners worked in orchards that seemed endless. There, they encountered something even harder to understand. Food being discarded not because it was unusable, but because it didn't meet commercial standards. Perfectly edible fruit was sometimes thrown away due to minor imperfections. In some cases, entire crops were destroyed to stabilize prices. For men who came from a country facing shortages, this was deeply unsettling. "They destroy food because they have too much," one prisoner wrote. "We asked if it could be sent to our families. We were told it was not possible." Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. When news of the invasion reached the camps, it marked a turning point. The sheer scale of the operation, thousands of ships, aircraft, and troops, demonstrated a level of coordination and production capacity that many prisoners had not believed possible. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels showing the landings, vast fleets, artificial harbors, and a steady flow of supplies moving onto the beaches. One officer later wrote, "It was clear then, not just that the war would be lost, but that everything we had believed about our enemy was wrong. We had underestimated a nation capable of organizing and sustaining something on this scale." Yet beyond industry and logistics, there was something else that left a lasting impression. Despite years of propaganda portraying Americans as weak or naive, many prisoners experienced a different reality. One shaped by a level of restraint and humanity they had not expected. When one prisoner received news that his son had died during the bombing of Hamburg, the camp commander personally delivered the message and expressed condolences. Moments like that did not fit into the framework they had been taught. And for many, it was precisely these small human interactions, repeated over time, that had the deepest impact. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher received a letter from his wife describing how difficult it was to feed their children, something unexpected happened. American church groups, through organizations like the American Red Cross, sent food packages to his family in Germany. Civilians in a country that was still being bombed. They made a distinction, one prisoner wrote. They said they were fighting Hitler, not the German people. At first, we thought it was propaganda, but it proved to be real. Medical care reinforced that impression. German doctors worked alongside American staff, gaining access to equipment and treatments that had been scarce or unavailable at home. Prisoners underwent operations that, in wartime Germany, were often reserved for elites. Mental health care, largely absent in the Wehrmacht, was also provided. Dr. Friedrich Bauer later noted, they treated psychological trauma with care, not punishment. This revealed something we had not understood. That restraint and humanity can come from strength, not weakness. By early 1945, American re-education efforts had expanded significantly. Thousands of prisoners voluntarily enrolled in courses covering political systems, economics, and civic life. Camp publications began discussing constitutional government, civil rights, and the future of Germany after the war. The transformation was not forced. It grew out of observation. Many prisoners had spent months or years witnessing how American society functioned in practice. One former officer later reflected, "We did not change because we were told to. We changed because we saw a system that worked. Ordinary people lived better than our elites. Naturally, we wanted something similar for our own country." For some, the change went even further. A number of prisoners expressed interest in remaining in the United States after the war, while others formed connections through correspondence programs. In the following decade, many would return as immigrants, carrying with them the experiences they had gained. Then came the final shock. In 1945, as Allied forces uncovered concentration camps, evidence of the atrocities committed under the Nazi regime began to circulate widely. Prisoners were shown footage, photographs, and reports. At first, some dismissed it as propaganda, but the consistency of the evidence and confirmation from Germany itself made denial increasingly difficult. For many, this was the most profound turning point. One prisoner summarized it starkly. "We believed we were serving a great cause. Instead, we had been used by a criminal system. The people we were taught to despise showed us a different standard of civilization." As the war ended in May 1945, prisoners prepared to return home, to a country that had been devastated physically and morally. Their final months in captivity often included vocational training, agricultural instruction, and basic education about democratic governance. They were not simply being released, they were being prepared for what came next. In the years that followed, programs like the Marshall Plan would help rebuild Western Europe, including Germany. For many former prisoners, this aligned with what they had already come to understand: that reconstruction, not destruction, would shape the future. Between 1945 and 1946, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners returned home. They came back to a country in ruins, but also carried with them firsthand knowledge of a different kind of society. Not an abstract idea, but something they had lived inside. A system defined by industrial capacity, institutional structure, and, perhaps most unexpectedly, a degree of openness and stability they had not been prepared to encounter. "We came to America as enemies, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as men who had seen something different. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We saw farmers feeding entire regions, workers building on an unimaginable scale, and citizens who treated even enemies with dignity. We realized that America's greatest weapon was not its armies, but its ability to create, and its confidence in that ability. We returned home with a different purpose: to help build a country that could create instead of destroy, that could prosper through peace instead of war. We arrived as soldiers. We left as students. And for that, we remain grateful." The hall fell silent for a moment, then rose in applause. Former enemies, now decades removed from the war, stood together in recognition of how much had changed since those first arrivals in 1943. The scale of the German POW experience in the United States was immense, and its impact measurable. Across the country, hundreds of camps operated in dozens of states, holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Facilities were built quickly, often in just a few months, and ranged widely in size, from small branch camps to large complexes housing thousands. At its peak in 1945, the system held over 370,000 German prisoners, part of a broader total of Axis POWs in the United States. Monthly arrivals increased steadily as the war progressed, especially after major Allied operations in Europe. Their labor became an important part of the wartime economy. Prisoners contributed millions of workdays in agriculture, forestry, and industry, helping address labor shortages across much of the country. Their work supported food production, resource processing, and infrastructure, all under regulated conditions. Escape attempts were rare relative to the size of the population, and almost all were short-lived. Most prisoners remained within the system, adapting to routines that combined work, confinement, and, increasingly, education. Educational programs became a defining feature. Tens of thousands of prisoners enrolled in courses, learning English, studying trades, and participating in discussions about politics, economics, and society. Camp newspapers and organized lectures created an environment where ideas could be explored more openly than many had previously experienced. After the war, the long-term effects became clearer. Some former prisoners chose to return to the United States as immigrants. Others maintained correspondence with American families for years or even decades. Many carried what they had learned back to Europe, where it influenced their roles in rebuilding society. Surveys conducted after the war indicated that most prisoners viewed their treatment positively, and a significant number reported that their perspectives had changed during captivity. For historians, this episode stands out not just for its scale, but for its nature. It was not a transformation imposed through force, but one that developed gradually, through exposure, observation, and experience. Daily life became the most persuasive argument. In the end, these men did not simply witness a different system. They lived within it. And for many, that experience reshaped how they understood power, society, and their own country's future. Their captivity, intended as a wartime necessity, became something more complex, an encounter with a different model of life, one that for many of them proved difficult to forget. In the end, America's greatest victory may not have been won on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where the visible reality of a functioning, prosperous society achieved something armies alone could not: a deep shift in how the enemy understood the world. The prisoners had arrived convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They left with a very different perspective. What they encountered was not just material strength, but a system that produced abundance on a scale difficult to reconcile with what they had known. The trains that carried them into captivity in 1943 brought soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that returned many of them after the war carried men who had seen alternatives, men who would later take part in different ways in rebuilding their country. Their experience became part of a larger transformation that shaped post-war Europe. Programs like the Marshall Plan and the emergence of cooperation between former adversaries helped lay the groundwork for recovery. In West Germany, this period would become known as the Wirtschaftswunder, a rapid economic revival supported by both internal reforms and external assistance. For many former prisoners, what they had witnessed in the United States stayed with them. They had expected to find a struggling, divided nation. Instead, they encountered a society defined by large-scale production, infrastructure, and a level of everyday stability that challenged their assumptions. Out of that experience came something lasting. Not a single moment of change, but a gradual realization, built from observation, that different systems could produce different outcomes. Historians often point to this episode as an example of how exposure can influence perception. It was not driven primarily by coercion, but by lived experience. Work, routine, education, and daily interaction within a different environment. In that sense, the story is less about a sudden conversion and more about a process, one in which individuals compared what they had been told with what they actually saw. Their return to Germany brought those experiences back into a society that was rebuilding itself from devastation. Over time, those perspectives became part of a broader shift that helped shape a new political and economic direction. The legacy of that transformation can be seen in the long-term relationship that developed between the United States and Western Europe, including Germany. Former enemies became partners, and cooperation replaced confrontation. Ultimately, this story suggests that influence does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from example, from the visible functioning of institutions, economies, and everyday life. For the men who lived through it, captivity became something more complex than they had expected. It became an encounter with a different way of organizing society, one that, for many of them, left a lasting impression long after the war had ended.